I have your consent, sir?
Now,
Everything you say will be held against you.
whenever I wonder what things are about, Grover lets me know that he doesn't know either. It's all a big zero.
Who lets you know?
Grover,
Rover. Oh,
Grover.
Grover.
He's like, I don't know. Hey, Grover, what's the meaning of life?
I love that. Where did you find that?
Might be a big zero.
Maybe the big nothing.
A big nothing. Ooh.
Well, he's kind of a perfect mascot for what I wanted to talk with you about today, being Generation X, so-called Generation X. I think both of us fit into that generation. Yeah, I was born in 74.
I think you're I don't remember when the next cutoff is, but you're on more on one side. I'm more on the other. But yeah.
Yeah, generally it's like 65 to 80, or sometimes it's pushed to 85.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a young Gen Xer, I guess. And but I'm not young. I
Yeah.
turned
Isn't that funny?
I turned 49 this year, and it's maybe why I've been reflecting so much on this generation. Um and also like dealing with like some heavy nostalgia for the 90s, I got to tell you.
Yeah, no, I've gotten waves of nostalgia for the 90s. And it was kind of interesting. I don't know how it looks from where you're sitting, but from where I'm sitting, the 90s revival never really happened. Like there've been a couple books. I know Chuck Klosterman wrote a book, and his take's all right. Like I like him enough, but it didn't get to the deeper elements that were going on there. And I'm not aware of a real rich reassessment of the decade, particularly the first half of the decade. And it's kind of weird, millennial, magical, recombinant creativity. And I don't know, there was definitely a particular, we were young, so you have that going on as well. But in the rearview mirror, I still think of that as kind of an extraordinary time, and in some ways sort of the last extraordinary time, meaning the time when the heaviness that was always, it's always around in the post-war world or in the world in general, but where it did not predominate in a way that certainly by 2000, 2001. Since then, it's just been a shadowy simulacra in a weird way. And so both the 90s, and there are very interesting things about our generation. And I do think it's valuable to think in terms of generations. It can be cliched, it can be easy, it can be wrong. But I do think it's valuable partly because with whatever other factors you might want to think about in terms of, say, permissiveness in the society, or teaching modalities in public schools, there's just the technological reality, and that to me justifies it significantly, both in terms of reflecting back on older generations like ours, or in trying to figure out what's going on with up and coming generations. Like, it's fascinating to sort of take, if you ever dip into like how millennials think about the younger generations, it's fascinating because you're like, whoa, like it's like different and similar. Like I get it, but it's also different because they have their own, kind of anxieties and concerns in a way that just don't quite resonate with mine. And I do believe there are really, really fundamental differences and distinctions that I think you can trace partly to technology, not entirely. I think there's also something about the relationship to the boomers. And for a lot of younger people, Generation X are basically boomers. Like, we don't, like when they say, okay, boomer, they could be talking to us. Like, there's a difference. They'll acknowledge it, but they don't really see it. And that kind of makes sense in a way, in terms of how we sort of were like the rebound and the digesting force and the kind of reframer of this explosion of, the counterculture. So there's a lot of things to talk about.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was looking around, see who's talking about Generation X now, and I was a little disappointed, maybe a little depressed by some of the characterizations that I found. Like a lot of them were superficial, like what you're talking about. Um, you know, grunge, kind of alternative music, MTV, Douglas Copeland's book, you know, speaking about the refusal to take Mick jobs in veal fattening pens and that kind of thing. But yeah, and so some of the terms that are used are that Gen X is the invisible generation. Another term I came across was the sandwich generation, that we're in between these two bigger generations of the boomers and the millennials. And there doesn't sound to be like a lot of appreciation for what Gen X has contributed. Um, and I think it's significant too. Like I see the 90s as the kind of last golden period. Um, but when my wife and I talk about it, you know, what's our role in the present culture? We've seen ourselves as being the possible bridge generation, bridging back to a time before smartphones and ubiquitousness of social media, things like that, and also like a bridge back to certain values that I think have been lost with all of that technological process or progress. Well, it's hard to say progress, but change. Uh, you know, and I think about DIY culture, transgressive art, transgressive music,
Remix culture, you know.
remix culture. Yeah. And I think like what defined our generation from where I stand anyway, in my experience of it was, I think we were the first generation to be critical of the previous generation and their values. And, but our response, I think, was different in that we became more politically apathetic, I think, and kind of withdrew from culture, which was, I think, the seeds of what has been called alternative culture. It was an alternative to the mainstream, but that itself got co-opted and turned mainstream.
Yeah,
But
in our generation, I mean, that's part of the story of our generation. Is like one way I like to think about it, and I've been sitting with this for a long time, and I think this is a helpful way to think about it. Even though it's broad brush, and anytime you're using a broad brush, you're missing a lot of important detail. But that the experience of the boomers from whatever 64, 65 to let's give it to 75, maybe even 1980 at the outset, but really 75 is the counterculture. There's a sense of kind of even though there's different factions of it, different even contradictory aspects of it, there's a sense of kind of a unified generational change. And then what follows that from roughly 75 to, I peg it to about 2000. And there's a guy named David Chapman, who was a very interesting thinker. He talks a lot about Buddhism, and but in a kind of a rationalist, post-rationalist way. Very interesting thinker, but he's done a lot of thought about subcultures too. Anyway, this period, so if you have a period from like 65 to 75, it's like the counterculture. From 75 to about 2000, I believe you can think about as the era of subculture. So what happens in subculture is like these various groups kind of go off on their own, and they dig more and more deeply into a kind of underground. And the conditions of technological media, which is again why I think it's legitimate to talk about generations, is because our experiences, and in particular our formative experiences, are fundamentally shaped by the media environment, the media ecology. So in this era, which is still up to the mid 90s, predominantly, with some important exceptions, analog era, that becoming subculture and digging into the underground, you're actually able to sort of be in the shadows. There's a great book about 1980s, like before alternative rock was a category, it was a space, and it's called What We Do Is Secret. And there's a sense in which these underground bands, like just to take an example, like when Black Flag started touring. So they're making local records. It's an independent label. It's really small. They just play locally, and they kind of realize, wait, everywhere across the country in any decent sized city, there's some kind of weird record store, punk rock bar, club. Actually, we can just network with those institutions, or not even institutions, those people, and like flyer and get put, and sleep on someone's couch and go and play a grotty little club and get in a van. And so you get like a national network, an analog network of independent labels making independent music for people who have decided or been initiated into getting into those worlds. And that's one of the things about, well, let me just finish the big picture and then come back to it. And so there are these conditions that make space for subcultures. The Grateful Dead is a very big one, a very big subculture. This still operates like a subculture, even though it's affecting large numbers of people. And then as digital media starts coming in, subcultures migrate online to varying degrees. So in the 80s, what was a zine world where people are independently making their own little zines, trading them with other people who are doing zines, buying things like Fact Sheet 5 that tell you all these other zine makers, and you kind of go into this rhizomatic world where there's people distributed and no one else is paying attention, and there's 100 copies of the thing or whatever. A lot of that energy starts to go into the internet. And so there's this period where on bulletin boards or listservs, early alt groups, whatever, that Usenet groups, that there's kind of this subcultural energy online. The Well is the kind of great example of this, where you have conversations that are public, they're accessible, but they're still really niche. And the kind of people who go there are usually pretty weird. Like, as somebody who is online, I got online in I can't ever remember what year, it's either 92 or 93, before the World Wide Web. And it was like full of like weird, queer, pagan, theorist, mystic, just great, fun, strange. And so it was still kind of subculture. And then at a certain point, it just all gets kind of recirculated and transformed in a way. And I believe this really strongly, and I thought a lot about saying it, and I don't like to sound like a grump, but I believe that in some ways subculture ends sometime and isn't really available anymore. What we have that people call subcultures now, like furries or something like that, they share many features of the zone that I'm talking about, but there's also a lot of really important differences. And so while it's not like I don't want to talk about contemporary subcultural energy or some other kind of word, it's also important to acknowledge what was lost. And this has a lot to do with the kind of fundamental difference between the analog world and the digital world that comes, which is this question of scarcity and access. So if I start to get into punk rock and I'm living in a suburban town and there's like a couple, what do? I go to there's no clubs even. They don't even come, they go down to the big cities. It's too far from me, but there's a record store. So I got to go to the record store. Now I go to the record store. What the hell do I buy? There's the older dude behind the counter. He knows, but I kind of have to impress him. I mean, he's not going to just tell me. So I got to buy the right records, start chatting and and maybe he'll drop me something yummy, and boom, then a vein opens up, and then I can start exploring, because there's no internet. The magazines that I have access to, Rolling Stone, are already too mainstream. I can't get to the underground except maybe my someone's older brother or whatever. So there's a process of entering into these subcultural modes that has an initiatory quality. You got to risk something. You got to explore. You have to put yourself out there. You have to not know what the fuck's going on. You have to be an idiot. You have to be a noob or whatever to get to, and this is true, in esoteric subculture, lots of different things that are going on. Sexual subcultures, some of them super transgressive stuff that's happening in the 80s, way more transgressive than before. Dark stuff, even, because it's all about finding these edges and going a little bit beyond them with it kind of in the secrecy zone. And so that initiatory experience, I think, really affects it shapes you, especially when you're young. It's sort of like going through rites of passage. Like I had a rite of passage that brought me into the Grateful Dead. I had a rite of passage that brought me into like weird religious practices, like going to ashrams and get smoking pot before we go in and the chanting Hare Krishna for 3 hours, because that's what the boomers were doing that we were going, but we were going kind of more as like heads that were like, wow, let's see what happens. But it required this kind of process. And now when everything's sort of available, not even available, but it's pushing, like the spiritual teachers are pushing you, everything's pushing. It's just such a different mode of subjectivity where like 15-year-old kids can know more details about the esoteric electronic scene in Cologne in 1972 than I could ever know, even as an adult, rock critic who was interested in that period. So that just changes something. And I think that it's partly affects the way that we kind of relate, and also part of our nostalgia, that we're not just nostalgic for a time when, and you're I'm 10, like whatever, 8 years off of you. So I have a little bit more, there's a little bit more of the 80s in my mix or whatever, but it doesn't, in my mind, really change until start changing until the late 90s. That we're not just nostalgic for like, oh, it was kind of cool back then and there wasn't as much surveillance. It's actually kind of a mode of being. And I'll say one more thing and then shut up. How to talk about this quality, how to name the generation or name the experience of the generation, is that we were raised when we were kids, interacting with media and interacting with the world. We lived in an analog world. Everything was analog. I remember the first computers that I saw at my dad's work. A friend his older brother was a computer nerd in the 70s, and he had like really early machines where you recorded the bits on cassette tapes and like whatever. And those were strange extrusions from some bizarre future that then took over. And there's, some real differences between analog and digital. And so I feel like the Gen X sort of live in what I call the analog sunset. And so there's a kind of melancholy to it, and also a sense of like, look, there were some real differences here, kids, but the kids are like, okay, whatever, like, so what? Like, some are interested because they have some historical consciousness or they want to know what came before or whatever. But for the most part, it just doesn't register anymore. So we're watching the kind of disappearance of a mode of being in the world that was really different. That analog mode, with media, not even talking about like relating to nature or whatever, but just the way relationship to media. And so that, I think, produces a particular quality to our experience where we're not just sort of critiquing and digesting and in some ways extending the counterculture, because in some ways subculture extends part of the counterculture, often less political or more anarchic, but that we're also in relationship to a whole mode of media that kind of declines. And with that, aspects of history, aspects of the scarcity world that creates initiation and discovery in a different way that happens once we get to digital abundance.
Yeah, I think that's really key as well, like the nature of the technology. Like I was thinking how important the photocopier was to our generation and DIY culture and sustaining and promoting subcultures. And certainly the early internet felt, like you're saying, the same. Like it felt underground. You could find these strange little corners by the same kind of word of mouth method. And it was really interesting. And I remember, like, for me, it was like a real turning point when Google started to create ads on the internet. And I remember, like, we were all talking about it, how that was going to change things and kind of ruin things. But the corporatization of the internet and media in general, I think, has had a big effect. Like, I remember, like, Terence McKenna talked quite a bit about this, about not being consumers, but being creators. And I think we did far less kind of gluttonous consumption or passive consumption like we had to seek things out that were interesting to us and maybe weren't so readily available. And that is a completely different mode of being and mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and actually, when you talk about the photocopier, and that's a great way into the differences between analog and digital, which is a really interesting thing, at least I think, especially for our generation to kind of meditate on, because we've sort of had these fundamental experiences of the difference. And how do we think about that difference? Well, some people, they often go to like, well, do analogs, does an LP, vinyl LP sound better than a digital recording? And that's just kind of an annoying argument. And they're both great or slightly different, whatever. But more important is the nature of copying, because with the photocopier or with the cassette tape, I'm making a copy of a record, or I'm making a copy of an image that I've cut out of a magazine. And every time I make a copy, it degrades in quality. And if I make a copy of a copy of a copy, you start hearing more and more noise, or you start seeing more and more artifacts as the image gets blurrier in a photocopier. So, for example, I'd get Grateful Dead tapes. That was the great era of the Grateful Dead tape, where you get these, X generation copies. Like sometimes you have like 5th generation copy of a great show from 1974, and you could hear it. And it didn't make it less magical. It just made it different. And the same thing with like, there were positive qualities of like you photocopy something over and over and over, and it starts to kind of get all weird and look like Andre the Giant or something, that kind of quality. And then when you're dealing with a digital copy, that just goes away. Disappears. And if you just kind of think about that as like it tells you something about the difference between those two. In one, copies over time develop their own qualities and kind of degrade. They sort of age. There's a sense of distance from a source, which can be magical too, can be kind of enchanted. Like I remember some guy who grew up in Hungary talked about, he says, you have no idea the magic power of a cassette tape that had been reproduced from another cassette tape, that somebody had recorded of a Jimi Hendrix record over the air from the West. Like, you have no idea the talismanic drug-like power of this cassette. And then when you get into digital, where you don't have this kind of degradation, there's other kinds of degradation that's interesting. It just shifts the mode. You're not in the kind of a historical relationship of lineage. You're just in this kind of sort of immediate reproduction, and it just feels different. It feels different to grow up around those kinds of copies. It's just different.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Something about the degradation puts us in a very different kind of relationship to time, like a very tangible relationship to time and passage of time and memory and things like that. And when things are reproduced to perfection over and over and over again, I think you lose that, and you're put in a more strangely liminal space where you don't have that same tangible sense of the passage of time. And you're so right. Like there's the cassette tape, there's the videotape too, which was another way into finding different subcultures. Like I remember it was like a rite of passage when I got my first Richard Kern video.
Yes.
And sitting down with my friends, like putting this thing in the machine, a little afraid of what we're about to see, and often not disappointed, like truly transgressive stuff.
Yeah.
But there was a kind of occult and magical quality to those things that we've either found our way to or were passed on to us by some older person. Like guys 8 years older than me were the ones making me, once they found out what I was into and that I was serious about music and things like that, they'd make me these mixtapes of Captain Beefheart. And I remember there was a guy who found out that I liked Prince, and I was like a little metalhead who loved Prince, which was weird. So he's like, have you heard the Black Album, which was this mythical album that was never released? And so he made a cassette copy of it. And yeah, it had a kind of yeah, talismanic, or yeah, very strange and magical quality to it. But now, like, all that degradation has been fetishized, and pretty early in the social media revolution. Like, I was one of the first people on Instagram because I was working in marketing, and the big draw to Instagram was the access to these filters, and they were all retro filters to make things look like Kodachrome or Polaroids. So already there was a fetishizing of degradation, and now,
Yeah, it
you
doesn't
know,
have any. Yeah,
yeah, like graphic design filters to grungify things and add paper texture and photocopy texture and all this. It's a huge market, and people are replicating those kind of degraded qualities without any connection to the process of it, like
yeah,
running things through a photocopier 100 times to get it looking more grungy. Like, that was a thing that I learned to do from people like Art Chantry, who was really big in the Seattle underground. He created the whole look of grunge, really, and
yeah,
his medium was the photocopier.
yeah. Absolutely. No, no. It's really key, and I think that part of the I think part of the strangeness for us is because those filters, or what those filters are simulating, are actually bound up with our memories. So like when I have the photos that were taken in the early 70s when I was a kid, and look at them, and they have that quality of degradation, and the colors a little oversaturating, kind of drifting or whatever, like that's actually a trigger for a certain kind of iconic relationship to time, like we were talking about. There's something about these analog forms of decay, or transformation, are not just linked to time the way you talk about it, but also to nature, because they
Mhm.
decay.
Yeah,
That's the world decays, and it's like,
things that are materially real decay.
yeah, and
And
you can say, well, digital is real. It's like a little thing. It's lodged in a piece of chunk. It's got silicon, da da da. So let's not pretend. In fact, they want us to believe it's not material. It's in the cloud. Well, no, it's not. It's on somebody's computer somewhere. But that said, the mode of physicality is, I think, fundamentally different, and it's really important to recognize that, and that analog has a natural relationship to nature, whereas digital has a simulated relationship to nature. So it simulates the decay, it simulates the quality of materiality that give us some kind of emotional hit. But in our case, because we're Gen X, it's like our actual fabric of memory. So it's like this weird, when I see those filters, whatever, and I still can get really nostalgic looking at photographs from the late 60s and early 70s, early to mid 70s, and the early mid 70s in general. And but then it's like, is this real, is it not, whatever. It's a very strange process.
mhm, yeah. The other thing I was thinking about was, like, as you're speaking about those subcultures and access and scarcity and things like that, there's also the element of ownership. Like, back in the day, we owned those subcultures. We owned the products of those subcultures, whether it was independent record labels or cassette tape duplication, videotape duplication, um, making flyers on a photocopier that anyone had access to, like kind of co-opting office supplies from those McJobs and using them for our own purposes. Now, when people create things, they don't really own it in the same way. It's all hosted on these platforms that are owned by these gargantuan corporations that don't care about culture. Do you think that has an effect on it as well? Like, you're talking about like people that we would maybe call gatekeepers, the people that you had to kind of impress or coerce into letting you in on the secret culture, whatever it was. But now, like, gatekeeping is seen as a really bad thing.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like the floodgates are open and we're getting blasted with all this content, which is just such an empty term, but I think it's actually fitting
yeah.
because it is just kind of content, and it's none of it is really meaningful, or it's
Yeah,
so ephemeral that,
yes, I agree. No, I think that the ownership is a real big part of it. And I remember in my community in the 90s, I was friends with some people. I think about um, Julian DeBell and Marcus Boone, who were writers. Julian doesn't write anymore, but he did a lot in the 90s and 2000s about technology. And we could see what was sort of happening. And then when we get into digital files and the beginning of file sharing, that's already like an interesting twist on ownership that was already different than what we were talking about before, because of this infinite reproducibility and the cheapness of storage. And that then is a kind of now we can see that as sort of a middle point between like in musical terms to the streaming era. And I remember having conversations even in the 90s about how significant ownership was as a way of constituting the self, by like you build up the self partly by the things that you own and decide to keep. And it's a really powerful way, and also a completely, novel one. 100 years before that, nobody had recordings at all. They were playing music. They could look back and go, wow, these kids today, they just collect pieces of vinyl that they buy. Like back in my day, we used to just play. Everybody knew how to fiddle.
No, even back then, they collected songbooks.
Yeah, they did. No, there's that balance is always going on. Just as today, there are zones in the culture that are incredibly creative, many of which you and I can't perceive or don't see because we're in our own little world. So the balance is always there, but there is also these significant kinds of shifts. And I think that the ownership of cultural objects, and this doesn't mean like whether or not you buy the file that you download or steal it. That's sort of already not quite ownership in the same way because it's sort of infinite. But when there's kind of that sense of limitation, it's part of the way you organize your sense of subjectivity. And so it's, very interesting to like give away collections and things like that. But like your hard disk crashes, you're like, oh yeah, bummer. Like if it's just a bunch of stuff of
it's backed up on the cloud anyway.
Somewhere, I don't know, So yeah, I think that the ownership, the idea of stakes, I guess, and the gatekeeper thing is really interesting. I can see both sides. I'm enough of anti-authoritarian. I'm sensitive enough to race and gender critiques to recognize how those hierarchies were also very restrictive in certain ways, and so there's real problems with it. But I think it's also pretty clear that what followed it was not, exactly the most nurturing for the human soul. And that I can't deny, in my experience, however privileged and specific it was, the role that gatekeepers played in initiating me into zones of magic and wonder that really changed me fundamentally, and it makes me still kind of even attached to some of that material, maybe even in a slightly unhealthy way, but definitely a lot of the music and ideas and cultural artifacts that I got turned on to in my teens and early 20s are still really significant for me, even if they're not really where I live anymore. And I think it's partly because I was shaped by the whole context, not just the material itself. And that's the problem with abundant content, is the context is just the same all the time. It's always the same context. I'm on a screen accessing something, or an algorithm is even suggesting something to me. And that thing may be awesome. And, I'm sure it's different when you're young and you have those youthful energies or whatever. But I remember here's I want to get into two differences. One is a little subtler, and one I think is very distinct. I taught a course in cultural criticism, a writing course in around 2012 to undergraduates. And I was like, I know what I'm going to do for our first assignment. Super easy. I'm going to give them a bunch of examples of great one paragraph record reviews, like the kind that Robert Christgau wrote, or lots of, spin, whatever. It's a whole style, the short, punchy rock review. I wrote
the original hot take.
Yeah, I wrote hundreds of these things, and they're fun because you're obsessed. It's ridiculous to try to use words to talk about music. It's so absurd that you have to make up for it in like these interesting ways, and you refer to other things, whatever. It's just like I love it. It's a fun genre. So I'm like, great, we'll do that. And so we read a bunch of them, and then like da-da-da. And then I was like, okay, so I want you to pick something that you're like super passionate about, like the thing you think people are idiots if they don't like. And like fucking over half the class were like, I don't know. And they didn't have it. And they ended up writing about pop music mostly, which was okay. They wrote, some of the things were really good. But that was like shocking to me, because that was my experience of my generation. Everybody constituted themselves partly through their taste in music. Everybody. If it was pop, if it was whatever, everybody had their thing. And it was very subcultural. You listen to metal, you knew the metalheads. You might not have been a metalhead exactly, but you knew those were the guys you saw at the parties. You didn't see the other people who were listening to new wave, because that was kind of a different thing or whatever. But then, you could move between, but it wasn't just the music. It was these kind of subcultural identities. And then, you would sort of like, by arguing with people or proclaiming the brilliance of X over Y, you shaped who you were. Mm-hmm. And it was just fundamental to subject constitute how you built yourself, how you not even built, just extended and clarified and expressed, signaled,
consolidated yourself.
Yeah. And so that's not there. And I was like, wow, that's really different. And then I've met younger people who are super passionate about certain things. And obviously that is partly what I'm talking about, but how they get there is so different that I just can't relate with it. And maybe it's just as interesting and magical and mysterious in certain ways. But for me, that was a real distinction, was like how you had stakes in the position that you had, and everybody did. And that was kind of a way that like relationships were constituted. Certainly a lot of the relationships I had, I mean, this is more of a nerdy guy thing. So, again, I'm just only speaking from my perspective, but definitely I would build friendships based on close affinity, but not identity. If it was identity, it's not that interesting. You want people who are like slightly different. They can turn you on to stuff or challenge some of your presuppositions. Like, no, I don't like the first Peter Gabriel record or whatever, you're like, wait, that's awesome. Anyway. So that's I think an interesting one, but the more significant one, I think, and I'm going to hold this one to being really distinct and very generational, is that if you grew up with this living surround of subculture, we're like subcultures, and subcultures have within them, they all have a kind of dynamic of authenticity. Like who's a poser, who's a newbie, who's deep, whatever. And part of that initiatory process, part of the gatekeeping, was getting into deeper and deeper zones of kind of authenticity. And some people were pretentious about it. Some people didn't care about it, but it's part of the dynamic. And what this then produced, and, I also came of age in the time when authenticity was sort of criticized as like a rock writer. I could never write, oh, this band is an authentic metal band. They really have that quality of authenticity. Like nobody would accept that, because we were also aware of the code of authenticity, as well as kind of how it worked in different worlds. So it was kind of a two-sided thing, at least from my perspective. Nonetheless, what that did produce, that is this distinction I want to talk about, is the idea and the fear around selling out.
I wanted to talk with you about this one. It's a big one.
This is a big one. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about the idea and the fear and the resistance to selling out, that you have you've developed something, you have a taste, you have an enthusiasm, you have a practice, you have an art, a point of view, and there's a world out there that wants to absorb it, brand it, corporatize it, and that to do that, you risk selling out. And that's something that other people perceive, people you might respect, but also, really importantly, you yourself would perceive. So again, part of the way that the self in Gen X keeps itself, it's like a moral value, really, is to not sell out. Or if you do sell out, you're kind of sheepish about it. Like I knew people who started in technology and they were doing really interesting creative things. And then at some point they just do pure marketing and they're not even trying to be edgy. They're just like in the heart of it. And they're just like, yeah, you know, it was time to do that. I needed to make the money. I was enough of the creative VR silliness. I'm going to like, whatever, you know. And so there was
some of that came along with them having kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's like, look, I got to pay rent. I live in San Francisco. I can't live in the loft with 5 other guys anymore. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a whole economic story that we could also talk about that sees Gen X's experience as the last space where there was enough kind of easy living that you could afford to kind of be authentic for a while, you know, and that it's just, like how we're living in a major city now, it's absurd. It's like you can't even compare it to our experience, let alone what the hippies got to do when they were living in hate for like $50 a month and they worked one or 2 days a month, and that was enough to take care of them, and everything was free because everyone was like living in a free culture.
New York and LA were the same too, right? And that, I think that helped to create a kind of soil for the subculture.
Yeah.
If you didn't have to take a Mick job and do the conformist thing, then you were able to, you know, make your zines and your noise music on cassette tape or whatever.
Yeah.
I just want to circle back to something. I want to come back to authenticity because that is a big marker of the generation, like in terms of values. But another value, what you're talking about earlier in terms of limitation. I think that's really important in that limitations define us in so many ways. And they define the Gen X culture and alternative culture, like just the limitation of a photocopier or a screen printer, limitation by technology. But it's like the limitation is what creates the sacred in a way. Like if everything is available all the time, then nothing is really special. And not only special, but not sacred, not to be revered and protected in the way that we felt about our subcultural artifacts and practices. And so there is a whole thing that I think that's been lost, demonized as gatekeeping, but used to be called initiation.
Yeah.
And used to have to put in some effort and you just had to persevere in order to be allowed into this sacred realm. And I think the loss of that is done a lot of damage to the soul of people who didn't have to go through that. And it is that kind of two-sided thing. I remember having also riffing on what you're talking about in terms of like how we defined ourselves through argumentation. I mean, the coffee house was the place where that happened. I remember sitting around drinking copious amounts of coffee and smoking clove cigarettes and arguing about music and art and even ownership and things like that when the internet was starting to really take off. Like I had a conversation with a friend who was a philosophy major and kind of an anarchist. And he was talking about how this is a good thing, that freedom of information is like the best thing to ever happen. So scan all the books, put them online for free, get all the music on there. And, you know, as someone who is a creator, I really had a problem with that. You know, I saw that, that devalued the art that I was making and struggling to make a living by. So now it's all kind of wide open.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you think about this relationship between valuing of limitations versus valuing of complete openness and freedom?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a key distinction. And I would say that our generation negotiated or was forced to negotiate that, both sides of that in a way. Because, you know, if you were online enthusiastically in the 90s, this was inevitably becomes up this question: how are we going to treat these digital artifacts? And so for me, even though I was a creator, I was also open to the arguments and the vision of this kind of immense library in the sky. And partly because I was also used to I would get media for free because I was a writer, so a reviewer, so I was sort of used to getting media for free. So I was like, yeah, media, free media, free media. I love it.
But also, like, your medium is words and ideas, which is a little different from art, like tangible material art making, right?
It's true. Although at the same time, you know, what I did most in the 90s as a writer was eaten by the internet, you know, like more than anything else, writing about pop music. Are you kidding? Like
Getting paid by the word.
How many people today write about pop music and get paid for it? Not a lot less than did in 1995 when I was, you know, I did all sorts of fun stuff. So it's like, I've definitely had the experience of what I do be kind of destroyed by, or, you know, radically transformed by the new situation. But I want to go back to something you said. And I still feel like there's more to say about the selling out thing, which maybe relates to this, but more specifically, the relationship between limitation and the sacred. I think this is something really I think there's a relationship between absolute abundance and the sacred as well. It has a different quality. I think it's worth thinking about, but let's stay with the limitation, which I think is much more visible and obvious and demonstrable. And what it made me think of, it just popped in my head, was being on the island of Malta. And there are these Neolithic structures, the remains of Neolithic structures on the, you know, Stonehenge era on the island. And there were a number of them that had a certain floor plan that I found really profound. Because in the floor plan, you could tell that you walked into one room and then there was another space, smaller, that you could go into to get into the middle of the building. And nobody knows exactly what they did it for. It's the Neolithic that didn't write anything down, but there's widespread, or, you know, significant and I think justifiable postulation that this is like the structure of a sanctum sanctorum. There's a temple. You go in the outside of the temple, no big deal, but there's an inner thing, and you can only some people get to go inside there. And that's a very, very deep architecture, not just literally in terms of buildings, but in the mind, in social relations, in social hierarchies, where there's an inside that's magical. And in fact, the magic is partly, even predominantly, in the process of recognizing the door and getting into the door. Once you're inside, you know, it's always like the joke with like a secret society. Like from the outside, you're like, oh my God, they have these mystical Freemasonic rituals with robes and they're revealing secrets of the universe. And so you climb up the ladder and you get the initiation and you're a neophyte, and then you move up the ladder and more mastery. And finally you get in the final door, the final level. You're up there, you're with all of the leaders of the cult, and they're like, all right, yeah, we got a fundraiser coming up. Somebody needs to make the cookies. They're hassling us about the rent, and the lights are broken. You know, where it's like, what? This is it. So that's, I think, part of the experience of a lot of subculture, even if the core of it is actually just whatever. It's just like having fun or dancing or certain kind of vibe or certain kind of dress. Maybe it's like a sexual practice or some kind of drug or, you know, whatever. It's cool. But it's the way that it sets up this space of limitation, of difficulty of access, of risk, of, you know, you have to kind of go back in time. You got to like
sacrifice
that. Yeah. You know, and so that becomes like a real sort of version of an initiation or something like that, that produces a quality of the sacred, even if it's just like like rockabilly night or whatever, but there's something about having to go through that process. And I have no doubt that there are versions of that today, but it's just so easy to see the way that the analog regime kind of supported that, and the subcultural regime supported that. And we just don't have those in the same way anymore. And here's another example, like fan culture. So being like a fan of Star Trek in the 60s and 70s, going to Star Trek cons and like building an alternative world with its own weird fake folk logic, with folk songs, because they weren't folk songs, and humor and lovemaking and arguments and whatever, all in the shadow of this weird media product that the studio didn't have any idea about. They didn't control this. They didn't have anything to do with it at all. Or the Grateful Dead, you know, where the Dead knew that they'd actually feed it. They'd say, sure, go ahead and tape stuff. We don't care. You know, basically, there's a little bit, but, you know, don't sell the recordings, but like, go ahead and bring your technology and record everything and you know, so you're allowed to develop your Deadhead world. But most of the Deadhead thing emerged organically over time with the fact that nobody else was really paying attention, right? Nobody's really, unless you go to Star Trek con, who cares about these people? They're just nerds. Nobody cares. But then at a certain point, the culture industry, and this has everything to do with the rise of nerd culture, which is something that also happens between the 90s and the 2000s. Really significant part of the story is that with the rise of nerd culture, and once nerd culture it gets established, then all those mechanisms of being a fan that were previously pretty organic, they required you to be like invested in some nerdy way in some cultural item, whatever. Now the producers and the studios and the record labels, everybody is completely aware of how all those logics work, and they actively promote it. They use their money. That becomes part of marketing. It's like, I remember reading about or Douglas Rushkoff, who's super good on all the stuff we're talking about. He's like, you know, delicious. He had an expose. I think it was in one of his great documentaries, Merchants of Cool, or he did a couple, where basically was it for the Hunger Games? I can't remember. So it was some like young adult film, and it was this description of this poor kid who gets like tapped by the studio to be an influencer effectively, although I don't know if we were using that language quite at that point. And they just worked her to the bone to get like some little nibble of being inside of this magical thing. And you're like, oh man, yeah. So that's another kind of shift. It's like culture figured out how to simulate these processes of initiation and passion that for us were organic, you know, to use a somewhat problematic organic simulacral distinction, but I think it's fair. And that's another kind of like, rupture point. But it also has to do with I think to finish up on an idea that we were talking about earlier about selling out, is for me, the resistance or the knowledge of selling out, where I have to acknowledge to myself when I am selling out, and also trying to live a life that I don't sell out, which I've been able, partly through fortunate circumstances, to be able to do. But I'm very aware of it as like a fundamental value that will never, ever, ever leave me. It is stitched into my soul. I bring it into spirituality. I bring it into romance. I bring it into friendship, whatever. It's just, you're not budging that guy. And then you just shift to just even slightly younger people. You know, certainly millennials, and certainly what comes after that. It's not like they're not aware of what these processes might be, but it's just not a value. It's just not a value. There's no, what are you talking about? What are you selling out? Huh? And then especially when you get to the era where we're all personalities, and we're all marketing our personalities, and the things we're doing on Instagram are kind of us and kind of not us, and we're aware of the logic of the market and the logic of self-promotion, and how if you like take a extreme stance, then you get more feedback, and if the whole thing is about attention, then you kind of create a simulacrum of your identity and you kind of fuck with it and you're sort of alienated from it. But it's also, you know, all that kind of stuff within that whole logic, like selling, what are you selling? What? It just doesn't even register. And that difference, like if I'm talking to a younger person and I go selling out and they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, that is like a real difference. I'm not going to try to convince you, and you can't convince me, but the distinction is the marker of something that really changes in society and in psychology.
Totally. Yeah. It's the difference between like us being so adverse to selling out versus now selling yourself is the thing to do. And the way to monetize social media presence and all of that. That's a profound shift. Like selling yourself back in the day would have been completely looked down upon. Like I remember back in the 90s, I used to do some cartoons for the local university paper. And I did a one panel gag where it was a Wheaties box at a breakfast table with Henry Rollins on the Wheaties box looking looking so punk, you know, and no caption or commentary needed. Everybody got that because at that time he was starting to show up on MTV promos and stuff and looking a bit ridiculous. But now people would look at that and just go, yeah, well, good for him. He got a Wheaties deal.
Yeah, no, it's a real, and I think to not overly romanticize it, it is true that of course people were building careers, and then as media shifted, there were people were navigating how to move through someone like Henry Rollins. How do I move through this new environment creatively? And part of it was that you could still make at least sort of a living in an underground world that wasn't part of what was perceived as the mainstream. But those distinctions, those boundaries are kind of gone. And that's part of the point about where we're at now. It's not just that everything's immediately accessible. It's just that the boundaries are gone, and that sort of fog of obscurity that stood between a subculture and the rest of the culture is absolutely gone. So that you actually have to run really fast to keep ahead of the way in which commentary and social media and websites and think pieces and hot takes and all of that stuff capture emerging subcultures, if you want to call it, or new movements or novelty or certain edge cases. So it's really hard to be an edgelord because it's all just kind of circulated really, really quickly. And there's some preciousness there, and there's some contradictions and things like that. Thinking about our experience of what does it mean to sell out, because you're kind of choosing what the thing was. I mean, even we mentioned Douglas Rushkoff. He's a really interesting example because he got paid some money to do some consulting or whatever. Oh, sell out. You're the one who's critiquing. He was like, God, I'm just trying to make a buck. I got a kid. Whatever. The guy's just
That's a good impression, by the way.
So it's and so for me, it's less about the reality of whether or not Henry Rollins was selling out by appearing on MTV or the Wheaties box or whatever, but it's more the way that it shapes a sense of the world, as the world has the potential to seduce you into losing your fundamental cool. And I mean that not in just superficial way, but I'd rather than say your fundamental authenticity, because I'm like, I don't know what that means exactly, but that structure is so key, and then that structure really kind of changes.
Well, I think it's all kind of still related to limitations in a way. Like what makes someone cool is that the amount that they put themselves out there or let you in on their life is limited. And I respect that. Like now, if you're always expected to sell yourself, even if you're creating a product or a piece of art, social media kind of demands that you sell yourself, that you put yourself out there, that you make these little videos, and it doesn't matter really what you're saying, but it's your face that captures the algorithm and promotes you.
Yep.
And people are really trying to keep up with how the media landscape is changing and what it demands of us in order to stay in the algorithm and remain visible and be promoted. That I just find that it's kind of so dehumanizing in a way that, and I refuse to participate in it. So the way that I try to remain authentic is to promote ideas more than myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
And I know, like, I worked in marketing. I was part of the cohort that shaped what we're seeing now, like started to create that whole social media world. I know how it works, and I know what it takes to be on top. And I'm just not willing to sacrifice what I value in myself and what I value of my life and the things I hold sacred.
Yeah.
It's not
I,
worth it for me. And I know I could be making a lot more money. My podcast could be a lot more successful if I played the game. I know the rules of the game, and I'm just not willing to compromise on
yeah.
what I really value.
No, no. I mean, I have a lot of a shared sensibility. I mean, when you talk about like it's not selling yourself, but thinking about ideas, I also think about for me are actually a kind of sense of I was myself transmitted to all these currents of esoteric lore, of hippie mysteries, of psychedelics, all these underground things. And not just that, also intellectual stuff that had its own, in the 90s, postmodernism had its own kind of, it was like in a weird way, another sort of subculture, one that was undermining cleverly a lot of the logic of authenticity that we've been talking about, and to my mind is part of that generation, which is often referred to as like irony, the importance of irony to our generation, which is true too.
Mhm.
So it's this balance, like it's the polarity is like authenticity and irony, like kind of going back and forth in a way. It's not just like a pure, that's the way I see it. And that's definitely my experience. Nonetheless,
Well, often ironies utilized to make fun of the inauthentic.
yeah, that's true too. Yeah, that's
Like,
true.
look at I've been watching a lot of Devo, like old early Devo appearances and videos. I mean, they kind of really brought postmodernism, deconstructionism into the mainstream, and it was like to imagine this band showing up on a mainstream television show nowadays and doing the crazy shit that they did, which was so brilliant,
Yeah.
like so brilliant and so kind of so refined in the concept being brought to life. Like even my wife and I are watching them and we're like, look at their movements. Like here's these nerdy guys who you wouldn't think are athletic or anything like that, but they're moving. They look like robots
Right.
or animatronic figures at Chuck E. Cheese or something moving. And it's the most remarkable thing. Like,
That's a great example, actually, of like where irony is not just a way of like disavowal, which is how people criticize it. It's just
yeah,
like
like snarkiness.
snarky, like not really living your life. You just like you're the know-it-all, or whatever. And that's always been a part of
Yeah, but you're a loser, like the guy, Ethan Hawke's character in Reality Bites. Like he hates everything. He's got enough intellect to be able to criticize everything pretty well, but he's not doing anything with his life.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, that whole picture of the slacker, that's a whole other kind of figure of the era as well, that we haven't really talked about. I mean, as you see, there's a lot of dynamics of it that are really it's very rich and I think that actually the slacker is a really interesting one in retrospect. So the slacker had some of the features of that Ethan Hawke character. There's often a kind of irony and a kind of disavowal and a not really doing anything because it's just slacking.
Yeah,
And
like a dropout from,
yeah,
you
but
know,
like a later version of a dropout, but you can tie it again to the countercultural
Yeah.
fantasy about dropping out. We're actually dropping out of this, you're discovering a new world.
But it was less utopic.
It
It was
was,
dropping out into a dystopia and just going, you know what? Fuck it.
yeah, it was like
It's like Beck's
rejection of
song,
the job.
I'm a loser, baby, so why don't you kill me?
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of sums up the slacker attitude, and the visual that he presented in that video is like,
Right.
he
But
is
if
the
you
slacker.
see, like, for example, if you go back and watch Richard Linklater's first movie, if you watch Slackers,
I
which is
can't watch it. I find it
it's
too
too
full of itself,
it's,
or
oh no,
yeah.
I beg to differ. It's not my favorite of his films, but I think it's actually a really important document, and I think it also shows an awareness. Almost, maybe this is giving, and I don't mean the film so much as just the whole culture that it's pointing out, is not just a fuck it attitude, but that it shows a presentiment of the fact that the world on the horizon, the digital world, the world of selling yourself relentlessly all the time, was the other that's what's coming. So let's just cut that sucker down any way we can right now, and like still have a place for maybe not the hippie utopia of dropping out, but at least the Church of the Subgenius idea of Slack as resistance to being incorporated into the Borg of it all.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I respect that aspect of the 90s, the more disaffected one that was also often associated with its apolitical quality, which is fair enough in a lot of ways. I wanted to get back just a little bit to the sense of like authenticity, like, or not so much that, but just this question of how to not sell out. And one of the things that I've gone to is I've been very lucky in that I have just enough, whatever you want to call it, recognition that I can coast on that so far. Maybe that might not be true in 5 years. So that if I want to get a book published, someone will still publish it without me, whatever, promising to turn myself into an online avatar all the time. I mean, I do have an online presence. I have certain numbers, blah, 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 but they're not great. They're just enough to be like a cult author in the old sense of the term that doesn't really count very much these days. But for me, it gives me enough ego satisfaction, enough sense that I haven't just been erased from the world, which might actually be spiritually the best thing that could happen to me. But for whatever, I still like having some kind of face out there. But I'm also really not interested in how people, and like the demands that people make if they're writing their first book or anything. I'm not going to do that at all. And the other thing that I've come to is that I've spent more of my time is now behind the scenes kind of culture making, rather than like me as the writer or the speaker or the pundit. Like, I'm so sick of the culture of online punditry, and even I stopped doing podcasts for a while. I was like, what am I doing all these things for? It's like, whatever. And this was different. It was a different topic, and I haven't seen you in a long time. So it's like as much a personal thing as anything. And feel a lot of resonance with you, and particularly how you approach spiritual stuff from this kind of sensibility, which I think is really, really important to me. But I'm also like just as interested in I'm involved in this kind of mutant meditation center right now in Berkeley, and it's very much in place. It's about the place. It's not about its profile online. And it's about booking people and curating events and seeing what the people who are coming really want and what they need that they don't know. And, like how to kind of do that. And I'm having a blast, partly because I'm involved in the work of culture creating. I'm still meeting people, which was always a major part of like why I was a culture critic, was because if I wrote a cool article about some band or some scene, well, then I might get to meet them, and then I could hang out. Like, I didn't have to worry about, like, I didn't have to go through the front door. Like, I could just go through the back door, so it's
pass.
like, and I just got the pass. And so I always like meeting people, and particularly people who are culture creators. I've always been drawn to people who are making the scene or throwing the show or making the flyer or making like more than the people who are there. I mean, whatever, the whole thing's fun, but I really have always been attracted to creators and scene makers. And so now it's kind of like doing that. But one of the things I love about it is that there's not that much attention on me. I don't have to do it online. I kind of show up. Sometimes I give talks, not that many. I'm kind of hanging out. I'm like, this is a cool scene. Like, it's refreshing to me to not be an avatar of myself in this online environment. And it's really hard to motivate. So, social, I have a tiny little social media presence at this point because it's just really hard to motivate. I mean, it's probably because I had I'd made my peace with Twitter a long time ago, and I curated in a way that was pleasant for me. I didn't have those negative things that other people describe. I didn't get into political arguments, met a lot of friends there. It was a great place to mostly find links and hear new books or whatever. And so all the changes that, Spaceman have forced on it, are really embittering and very filming.
Wait, Spaceman? I hadn't heard that one
I
before.
don't like saying his name.
Mr. X.
Mr. X. Yeah, this is called Mr. X. Dr. X. He's not a doctor, Mr. X. He's
But
not even.
yeah, like a Bond villain.
Yeah.
Dr. X.
I mean, it's fascinating. These
Pseudo Dr. X.
rich guys in our imagination is fascinating. These characters.
Yeah.
Palmer
Well, I totally feel you with that uh kind of hunkering down, not engaging so much with the self-promotion, but focusing on not just culture creation, but subculture maintenance,
Yeah, subculture.
right?
Yeah.
Like that's what you're keeping alive there in your little renegade meditation center. I feel that too, like coming out of COVID, where I had to focus a lot on doing things online. And, so doing online counseling with people or integration work, I had to be online more to let people know I'm out there and competing in this incredibly saturated marketplace. And, so after a couple of years of that, we had moved to this really small community. And I started to look around, like, how can I actually help to sustain some of the things, keep them alive, things that I really value that I feel are being lost. As somebody in my late 40s, it's time for me to contribute to an actual community and to put down some roots. And I looked around and, okay, there's not a whole lot for young people to do here. There's no counterculture coffee shops or meeting places or anything like that. And so I started to create that in what's called a community school here by doing a youth rock band program. And you know how the coolest thing for me is seeing these really young people who are, I don't know what you call them now, Generation Z, something like, right? But like 15, 16-year-olds. And they show up dressed exactly like I've dressed since 1992, wearing plaid, jeans, long hair, and wanting to play all of these old grunge songs. And it is the coolest thing. And they're not interested. I tried to start a Facebook group. I'm like, okay, I got to communicate with people in the community. They're like, no, we're not on that. Just get us on a group text.
Yeah.
But it is so cool. And they seem to really be interested in more than just the superficial aesthetics of the 90s. So I think that 90s revival you alluded to earlier, I think it's actually happening, but we're not hearing about it so much because a lot of these really young kids are also like us. It's like that great 30-year cycle thing. They're also rejecting, I think, what the millennials put so much value on. So there seems to be something kind of bubbling up, and I'm really hopeful.
Yeah.
One of the things I did is I made old school flyers for this rock band, and I did a kind of piss take on the Sex Pistols album cover. So I'm putting it up around the school and in the community, and it says, "Never mind the ball sports. Here's rock band." Because it's for the kids who don't fit into the sports programs and stuff, right? And so I ran it through the photocopier, made it look grungy and all of that stuff, and put them up everywhere. The kids were really intrigued by it. But then the next week I went into the school and I noticed somebody else had drawn a kind of old school heavy metal flyer type thing for their vintage clothing swap that they were putting on. And so I said, I wonder if like something about my flyer seeded the kind of hand doneness, kind of retro quality of this
Yeah.
photocopied flyer. So I'm wondering if that's to
Well,
come. And so this gets back to what I'm talking about. Like, what's our role
yeah,
now?
that's a really good question. I think you're right, that there's reason to hope on that level, and that a lot of those efforts aren't going to be visible, partly by design. And so it's like, rather, it's when we have conversations like we've been having. I'm really glad you took it in this direction, because it's really easy to get into like kind of kind of a pessimistic perspective,
Yeah, which is so boring.
which is boring, and it's a trap. And even as you age, I mean, to me, I think that's one of the, especially if you've spent time in subcultures when you were younger, like one of the great uh enemies as you age is kind of like bitterness and cynicism. Oh, it's so cool. You kids today, right? Oh God, I never got my, but I was out there.
Ugh.
I've seen so much of that, and it's really, really a must to avoid. It's spiritual poison. So
Yeah.
I love this gesture towards hope, and also like the practical DIY, sort of offline or minimally online ways that young people use to, make something happen, enjoy themselves, find something new, uh, get together locally and more. And the fact that we don't see it, that's by design. And so
That's part
therefore
of it.
its absence should not indicate that that the only thing people are doing is what you see online.
Right. It only
Oh,
exists
it's
if
only YouTube influencers and, whatever, uh, big hyper fans of Taylor Swift or whatever. It's like, no, there's so much stuff happening that we can't see. And then what is our role? And I think it is to, be ourselves in relationship to like even these old elements of like not selling out, a certain relationship to authenticity, a certain relationship to history, certain reticence around the online environment, the fact that we don't want that. Like, I don't want that. I don't care. I really don't care.
It's
Like,
not worth the,
it's not,
yeah, not worth the cost.
and so just even being that way, and I've definitely encountered a number of people, different generations who were younger that responded to that part of me, and some of them were like, so even some of them got rid of their cell phone. Whoa, I didn't do that.
I'm not
And
willing to go that far.
yeah, whoa, that's too
I
far.
still
I'm
need
not
Google
that
Maps.
hardcore. I'm not even. I'm just not quite playing the game the way I'm supposed to play the
Oh,
game.
for me, it's just a good tool, actually. Like it goes back to the DIY culture, like the voice memo app, and things like that. Even the little note app, I use that stuff all the time. So I kind of use the iPhone in like a old school way.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's and a lot of it is on us to like figure out how to manage that, as best we can to keep those things. And that's a lot of the way I orient is like, what is in me that's not necessarily from me directly, but more that I received
Mhm.
some transmission, some vibe, some way of being, some books, some current of music, whatever. I received that.
A
What
style,
is the
even
way?
just a
Yeah,
style of being,
yeah.
right?
What is the best way to move forward that nurtures that, or keep, even just protects it, that kind
Yeah.
of keeps it alive? There's an image in the I Ching that I often think about. There's one of the more heavy hexagrams is 36, sometimes translated as darkening of the light. And it's basically showing a situation where the exterior situation is dark. And it's just all about like, yeah, you just keep your little lamp alive. And sometimes that's all you can do. And I think we can do more. Would be use our communication, our privilege, our hope and faith in other people to like get out there in the world and try to make situations that will help others, and especially younger people. But there is an element of it existentially, like especially when we get sort of like drawn into some of the challenges of our moment, and well, who are we, or like, oh, I should be making more money, or I should be more famous, or oh, how come I'm not, like for me, it's like, oh, I gotta be like a thought leader, a thought leader. That's what I am. I'm like, I'm not a thought leader.
Look at Doug Rushkoff out there. He's the thought leader.
I mean, he's actually an interesting example of someone who does play on that scale, but but he has kept his values.
He does it in a way that I respect.
Yeah, his values have even gotten even more articulated. Like he's more critical, way more critical than he used to be, and in an appropriate way. And he's like, yeah, whatever, call me hypocrite, but I see what I mean. I don't know. I respect the way that he's done that. But I think that it's just also really important to be aware of the way in which you're also like keeping a sort of flame alive that isn't everywhere. It's not out there, even in our generation. Like people lose it along the way or whatever. It's like, oh no, okay, this is a real thing. It's like a real, energy that we have in this kind of analog sunset, that can light other fires that we just don't have no idea how it's going to, take off. I mean, things are going to change so much that's what brings me heart is like, it may look now like you're stepping away from the big battle of influence where everything scales and all the big boys and girls and in betweens play ball, and we're just like hiding in our local communities, like making flyers, and I'm setting up lectures where 20 people are going to come and whatever. Yeah. But what is coming is so off the hook.
Yeah.
With just AI alone. I don't want to talk about it, but just whatever that is, we have no way of knowing what values and what practices actually end up making a difference because it's so off the hook. And in a way, great. Then keep the faith, keep the practices, keep the sense of intimacy and locality and organicness and embeddedness in your local community and the ways in which people relate, whatever. Keep that alive and thriving as much as you can, because you just don't know what's going to actually scale in the kinds of situations that will be happening in 20 years.
Yeah. Well, I think you'd agree, but I suspect that all of those values and qualities that you just listed are going to be sought after and revalued when the technology boom inevitably busts. And it's already busting. I mean, you just look at mental health numbers across the board of kids who grew up with smartphones and social media. Something's crashing down. And I think it is our duty, actually, and maybe the best response to the selfishness of the boomer generation is to think about keeping those embers alive, and not just kind of doing it passively, but to go out into the community and go, hey, here's something that I've got from when I grew up, when I was your age, that was really good for me. I'm here if you need me. Like making yourself available, but not doing it in a passive way, but actually engaging with culture creation and in the social construct.
Totally. I'll just, maybe wind up here just by saying that's been my experience this my post-pandemic thing has been, partly doing this community project, the Berkeley Alembic, and really getting a lot of rewards from just the process that you're talking about. So yeah, I think it's a good note to maybe end on.
Yeah. Any thoughts on a better name for Generation X, or is that a fitting name?
It unfortunately with even with the Mr. Spaceman and his fetishizing of the letter, but I guess he's in it too. Maybe that's why he's been into the word X forever. Like the kid's named X something, and he's been like thinking about X forever. But he's an X. He's us. So it's like maybe there's no way out.
I didn't think he was old enough, but maybe he is. Yeah.
I think how old is he? I think he's.
It's hard to tell with those rich guys. They age in a strange way.
Oh, I want to see how. Let's see. He's born in. Yeah, he's 52, man.
Okay. Well, God, we can't end this on Elon. Maybe I'll back it up and cut us earlier.
It's fine. I actually think you should forget that.
What, cut him out?
Yeah, just
Cut
go
that.
back to where
He
we
can't, he can't be the last word.
That's what I mean. Just cut
Yeah.
out this last bit. Because I gotta go anyway. It's like 12:30.
All right, man. I really appreciate it. It's been fun talking with you.
Yeah, because it's been great. Really good to see you. And hopefully, I don't know if you come down here. But if you do, give me some advance notice and we'll get you doing something at the Alembic. It's a real fun crowd. And I do this all the time. All my old friends are coming out of the woodwork, and when they're in town, they're doing stuff, and it's fun.
Yeah, that'd be great. We're planning maybe a West Coast trip coming up. I haven't been off the island in like 3 years, man. I'm telling you, I've really been rooting down.
Oh, that's great.
But I'm starting to feel the itch,
Yeah,
so let's get moving again.
let me know.
All right. Thanks,
Okay,
Eric.
man. Bye.
Bye.